Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Fireside Chat on macroeconomics, the state of the economy, and the economics profession. My name is Mike Radzicki, and I'm an economist at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and I'll be the moderator for the session. And tonight, joining us, we have three economists, two economists and one financial planner and radio show host who does business and economics, and I'd like to introduce them. I'm going to sit down to do that. So, starting to my far right, we have Dave Colander, and if you'll permit me, I'm going to read a little biographic sketch on each person. Dave received his PhD from Columbia University and has been the Christian A. Johnson Distinguished Professor of Economics at Middlebury College in Middlebury, Vermont since 1982. In 2001 to 2002, he was the Kelly Professor of Distinguished Teaching at Princeton University. He has authored, co-authored, or edited over 35 books and 100 articles on a wide range of topics. His books have been or are being translated into a number of different languages, including Chinese, Bulgarian, Polish, Italian, and Spanish. He has been president of both the Eastern Economic Association and History of Economic Thought Society, and is or has been on the editorial boards of numerous journals, including the Journal of Economic Perspectives and the Journal of Economic Education. Please join me in welcoming Dave Colander. Sitting next to Dave is Barry Armstrong, and he has more than 25 years of experience in the financial services industry and hosts WRKO's Financial Exchange program every weekday from 10 a.m. to noon. Barry also works with the independent financial professionals at Armstrong Advisory Group, which he founded in 2004 to serve individual investors and small businesses in New England. Barry begins conducting investment and economic research each morning during the 6 o'clock hour. I assume that's a.m. hour. His research keeps him abreast of economic trends to benefit his clients, and is also used during the financial exchange each weekday. Barry is a contributor to Fox 25 in Boston and New England Cable News. Barry graduated from Pace University in New York with a Bachelor of Science degree in Accounting and Management and holds Series 6, 7, 24, 63, and 65 licenses. In addition, he is licensed for life, accident, and health insurance. And he's a registered representative with Securities America, Inc., and an investment advisor representative with Securities America Advisors, Inc. Barry was born in Canada and is now a citizen of the United States. He resides in Medford, Massachusetts with his wife, where they have raised their 5 children. Over the years, Barry has coached his boys in hockey and cheered on his sons and daughter in lacrosse, soccer, and track. Please join me in welcoming Barry Armstrong. Finally, to my immediate right is John Harvey. John earned his PhD in economics from the University of Tennessee in 1987, and he's been employed at Texas Christian University ever since, where both his research and teaching have focused on international monetary economics, macroeconomics, and contemporary schools of economic thought. He has 40 refereed publications, 2 edited volumes, and is the sole author of 2 books, the most recent of which is Contending Perspectives in Economics, a Guide to Contemporary Schools of Thought. He also has a keen interest in system dynamics. And while he still considers himself an amateur, 5 of his articles have focused on building system dynamics models of various economic phenomena. John's service has included Department Chair, Executive Director of the International Confederation of Associations for Pluralism in Economics, and various other positions in academic societies and journals. Currently, he is the editor of the World Economic Review and writes an economics blog for Forbes called Pragmatic Economics, which offers economic commentary in a manner understandable to the general public. John was born in London and struggles annually with the July 4th holiday, but has managed to come to terms with what he calls Armed Tax Evasion Day. He has been married to his wife, Melanie, for just under 30 years, and Melanie's here this evening joining us. Welcome. And they have 21-year-old twin daughters. Sadly, neither of them wants to become an economist. Though John has been successful in passing on his love of all things Star Trek, Star Wars, and Lord of the Rings. Please join in welcoming John Harvey. Okay, a couple of comments on how we're going to run this fireside chat. I'll pose one at a time two sort of open-ended questions to the panel, and we'll give each of them about 5 minutes to give initial answers. Then we'll provide a little bit of time for them to react to what each other have said, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. There are two microphones, as you can see in the aisles here, and we ask that anyone who would like to ask a question to the panel queue up there, and then when you get to the microphone, please speak into it, as this session is being recorded, and it is crucial for the recording that people speak directly into the microphone. Okay? And then once we do the first question, we'll do a second question similarly, and then if any time remains at the end of our session, we'll kind of throw it wide open. Okay? All right, with that, let's begin. So here's our first open-ended question for members of the panel, and then I suppose we'll go start with Dave and work towards me. Question number one: what do you feel is the greatest challenge facing the United States and world economies? Dave.
In 5 minutes, sure. I'm just back from Israel teaching a mini course in history of thought. And Ariel Rubinstein, who's a game theorist, a really high-level game theorist, ended his book, Economic Fables, which is a wonderful book that I suggest people take a look at, saying that when he's asked to talk about policy, he starts off any discussion with the views I'm going to present reflect views that have developed from my life over a long set of areas. The role that my understanding of game theory, my understanding of economic theory really play in answering those questions are very small and probably cannot really be separated from other things. So take what I'm saying not as here's what an economic scientist would say, or here is what economics has to say, but here's what an individual who has certain backgrounds have to say. And not only take it from me, but take it from every economist you listen to. That the discussion of policy, the relationship between the theoretical issues that we deal with and the actual policy discussions that get there are so tenuous that it's really hard to say, here, this is what economics is saying. And a lot of economists far too often sort of suggest that they have the truth. We don't. We have views of things that have developed over time. And so let me start very much with that statement. Then sort of I took a look and say, what's the most important challenges for the US and the world economy? I've used 2 minutes already, so now. Again, do you mean short-run challenges or long-run challenges? And that is really, I think, one of the key issues. That, sort of almost all the discussion is about short-run challenges. The really deep, problematic ones are long-run challenges. And those long-run challenges are hardly even being discussed, hardly being talked about. And sort of one of the problems is the way you deal with short-run problems often makes the long-run problems worse. And the way you deal with long-run problems makes the short-run problems worse. And so one of the big problems is, I think, how you get democracies to deal with long-run problems. And that's an extraordinarily difficult case. I looked, sort of the theme of this conference is reinventing life on a shrinking Earth. So I thought, does that fit my vision of what the problem is in the US? And sort of for the long-run problem, I don't see that as the problem. I see the primary problem that we're facing is the connection of activities to income. Okay, so if you take a look at the way our system is structured, it was here if you work. You know, you have certain income coming in and the property rights work enough to sort of keep the system together. The changes that are taking place, first with globalization for the US, and more recently with a lot of the new technology and everything else, are fundamentally changing that relationship. So that here, we don't have enough work for people. We're an affluent society. We have more than what's needed. But in order to get people so they can get part of that income, we haven't structured it. And that goes back to the structure of property rights, the way in which property rights are developed. And so I've been looking at John Stuart Mill's discussion and defense of capitalism as opposed to socialism when he was defending against Marx. And what he said was the laws of property have never yet conformed to the principles on which the justification for private property exists. And sort of it's the structure and the way we have property rights. And those goes back to patent issues, copyright issues, trademark issues, a whole set of structural laws that have channeled all kinds of income to a very small set of people and haven't figured out a way to do it. So figuring out that is, for me, the biggest problem that the US faces. Thanks.
Thank you. Barry.
You know, it occurred to me during dinner that my talking to you all about economics would be like Fred Flintstone trying to teach Tiger Woods how to play golf. I would be the Fred Flintstone, by the way. So I have my 3 pages of notes, which I'm not going to use at all because I decided to change my topic. And I'm going to share 2 stories with you that are related on a family basis. My daughter, who's 26 years old, graduate of Trinity College, is a big sister to a young lady who's in the 7th grade, lives in Waltham, Massachusetts, which is a suburb of Boston. And this young lady is Guatemalan, and English is her second language. She goes to public school in Waltham, and in that public school, they give her an iPad to use, and she comes home with that iPad, and she lives living in public housing. She has no access to internet. Now, my daughter is trying to tutor her and teach her how to stay up with academics. She's a smart girl, but it's almost impossible for kids today to be able to pursue academic endeavors. Imagine your students trying to do their homework, if you will, without access to the internet. And that's what this young lady from Guatemala is struggling with. So that's one circumstance that is based on our family. The other circumstance is related to a young man that we adopted 6 years ago. He was from Congo. His family was slaughtered during the Civil War in the Congo. He was a refugee living in a refugee camp in the Sudan, escaped to Nairobi, and the United Nations got him out of Nairobi along with several 100,000 other refugees. He comes over to the United States, hadn't been to school at all, had not been to any kind of academic environment at all for 6 years, lands in Medfield Public School System. Now, if you don't know Massachusetts, Medfield Public Schools is, I don't know, probably top 20, 30 schools in the state. And Massachusetts is the highest academic standing state in the country. So here's this poor kid who hasn't been to school at all in 6 years, and they drop him into the 9th grade in public high school. Now, I can tell you that it was a struggle for him for his 4 years in high school, both academically and socially. There were struggles. But here, this kid finishes up through Medfield High School, albeit not at the top of his class, but he did finish up. He ends up at Bridgewater State University, and 2 years in a row, he is made Dean's List. And I bring that up partially because I want to brag about my son, but to explain what I perceive to be the most important issue, which is access to information, which you get through the internet, but education. We're all involved in education, and education is going to change. And in order for us to educate the billion people that live in Africa the 1.3 billion people that live in India, the billion people that live in China, they must have access, unfettered access, to the internet. So I think, from my perspective, access to the internet and education. Those are the two biggest issues facing the world economy from this man's perspective. Thank you. John.
Well, thanks a lot, Barry. Now I have to listen to my wife for the rest of the night, who is a very active public school advocate, say how much better your comments were than mine. Let me say, first of all, what a great thrill this is for me. One of the first articles I ever read coming out of graduate school was by the guy to my left right here, if I may quote the title, Institutional Dynamics and Extension of the Institutionalist Approach to Socioeconomic Analysis. And that really had a huge impact on me. I mean, even, you mentioned I've written a couple of papers using system dynamics, but even when I'm not, the whole idea of endogeneity, of circular causation and so forth has informed most of my research. And something that really struck me in trying to think about what I wanted to say to a system dynamics group about the biggest problem we're facing is, something that I took with me was the idea that people think in straight lines, but society works in circles. And so that when we try to apply policy by using the straight line thinking, we oftentimes end up with at best an impotent policy and at worst a disastrous one. And that's the label I want to hang on austerity programs that are being imposed around the world, which have been absolutely tremendously successful in creating austerity. And that's about it. And in the particular case of Greece, you have to understand the system, the way the Eurozone is set up. And there's three things you have to bear in mind with the Eurozone so you can sort of see the system that's creating the problem. Because no amount of bailouts, no amount of restructuring is ever going to make any difference whatsoever as long as the system is broken. And that's what's going on. So three things. First, a nation's imports are highly dependent on GDP. That when your GDP goes up, guess what? Everyone buys more stuff, and actually out of proportion. I talked about elasticities earlier. Actually out of proportion, when GDP goes up by 3%, imports tend to go up by more than 3% and vice versa. So first thing, if your economy does well, you import more. Second thing, foreign debt is created by trade deficits. Right? Net foreign debt is going to be from a trade deficit, not from a budget deficit. And the Greeks, and the only way to repay the accumulating foreign debt is to have a trade surplus. Right? Third thing, the Eurozone has no mechanism for resolving trade imbalances. Right? For example, if the Greeks still had the drachma, then while they had the trade deficits, then the drachma may well have depreciated, thereby reducing the size of the debt that they were accumulating. So they have no mechanism in the Eurozone of reducing foreign debt, of reducing trade deficits, other than let's throw your economy into a horrible recession, because if nobody has any money, your imports will go down. So I mean, in that sense, it's a logical solution because it's a crappy system. And I was just messing around with the numbers here. It turns out that since their entry into the Eurozone, up to their crisis, Greek GDP grew at 2.72 times faster than German. All right, 2.72 times faster than German GDP. At the same time, Greek imports from Germany rose at 2.77 times faster than German imports from Greece over that exact same period. Now, there are other factors as well that you have to bear in mind with why the Greeks have a big trade deficit with respect to Germany in terms of wage policies in Germany. But the problem is that the Greeks are being, and I'm sure there are corruption problems and so forth, but those don't go away. Or rather, you take those away, you still have the systemic problem. And the systemic problem is that in the Eurozone, if you grow faster than your trading partners, you accumulate debt, and there is no mechanism of reducing that debt other than throwing the economy into a recession. And if anyone wants the actual unemployment rates in Greece through Spain, they're just really high. Right? So, I mean, Greece is 26%, Spain 22%, Ireland almost 10%. I mean, and what's it accomplishing? It's accomplishing high unemployment rate, and until you change the system, you won't change what's going on. And that's my system dynamics problem.
There you go. Thank you, John. Anyone want to elaborate on their earlier remarks or react to someone else up here at this point?
Amen.
I guess my reaction to the statements regarding austerity in Greece is, why is it so difficult to communicate that message to the rest of Europe? And why has Germany has forgotten the lesson of 1953 when 53% of their debt was forgiven. So where's the disconnect?
Well, they say that the people who are in the best position to change the circumstances are also the ones who tend to have the least incentive to change the circumstances. And so, how is it in Germany's best interest? In the short run, this goes back to something David was talking about, in the long run, Germany is better off, because you don't want to destroy your trading partners. It's why the New England Patriots, if they give them any draft picks this year, it's why the New England Patriots get the last draft pick, because they won the Super Bowl, all right? So we punish the winners in the NFL. And why? Because we want the league to survive. We want to make sure that at some point there's another team to actually play. So, but in the short run, I mean, the interests are such that it's better off for Germany. I also think there's a problem of economic theory, but we'll be addressing that one.
Let me go back and take the other position just to sort of offer that. So the German position is not one here, we need austerity for austerity's sake. So here there's an overall problem. There was a structural problem with the beginning of the euro. The creation of the euro was done for political reasons, not for economic reasons. Economists, to their credit, actually predicted, these problems would occur and develop because, that's the nature of it. And the decision was made for political purposes. That if you're going to have a monetary union and take that valve off, you've got to create a fiscal valve that can have it. Greece then sort of said, here, we can grow a lot because it had much lower interest rates. It took the advantage of that for all the time knowing that there's a long-run problem that's going to be developing. Everyone knew that. About 3 years ago, it came to a head, and then they said, well, if we let that happen, then all the private banks are going to go under and everything else. So we have to solve it. How will we solve it? By transferring all of it and saving the banks, moving it to the governments. So it was simply done sort of to move off the private books, where it would have, sort of had global contagion, to the government overall. All could have been predicted, all was predicted and known, but it was done for political reasons. Now, when you know the consequences and it's done for political reasons, you have to say there was a reason that was going on. And it was a reason, sort of that was going on, that people were willing to accept that. Now the question is, if we give in and sort of don't sort of do this, that is going to be seen and have consequences later on. So there's always a system within a system. And if you take that other system, that other long run here, and saying, yes, it always makes sense to bail out. But at some point, it doesn't make sense to bail out. When that is a matter of judgment. It's not a matter for economists. And so what I see is for economists to be saying, here, this is definitely wrong, sort of, and sort of where to stop isn't at all clear to me. And that's a political, philosophical issue, much more than it is an economic issue. So I think everybody recognizes there's a circular flow there. The question is, here there's a circular flow that's going to continue on in a variety of ones. And the answer is, of course, if this stopping it is there, you never should have allowed it to begin in the first place. Sort of that's the type of political systems and discussion that I think has to be taking place.
And I would agree that the Greeks joined for political reasons, but I guess I go back to, and I don't know if you were implying this, that, that the solution is to bail them out. I wasn't suggesting that at all. I was suggesting that the system needs to be scrapped, that as long as the system exists like this, as you say, it's going to create these problems over and over. And the irony is, if you're Greece, why do you join the Eurozone? Gosh, we're going to grow really fast, and the incomes of our people are going to go up, which is then going to cause big trade deficits, and so it ends up creating a long-run drag. And as you were saying earlier, we have the goods and services. That's not a problem. The problem is figuring out how to generate the income for people, and they figured out a way to generate income for people, but in the end, because of the way the system is set up, that created the debt that then...
that begs the question, though. Is the euro dollar a failure? Is it a failed social experiment?
Again, it's a political experiment. Sort of, and the biggest reason I kept asking people, why are you creating this, is to hold Europe together. Now, whether it's a failed political system, I think, is what we're looking at. And, you know, so it very well may be.
But what you said is exactly right, that if you're going to do the common currency, you have to have something done with fiscal policy as well, because the 50 states of the United States have a common currency, and so, you know, it's not as if that's unknown. But then we also have, when West Virginia has a trade deficit with, you know, Texas, well, then we end up with transfer payments that.
Right. But there's limited amounts that you'll get, you know, so they're within Europe. So you can, within the US, look at the difference, you know, Boston, how it's doing compared to southern cities, or New York State has Jamestown, New York, my hometown. I just went back there. Jamestown has gone down from 55,000 to about 30,000. You know, sort of the biggest business there, I think, is sort of funeral homes. You know, sort of because, you know, sort of that's what sort of exists within Jamestown and upstate New York. And that's the transfer that's going there. All the transfer, again, comes back to what I said. The way in which income is now structured is sort of to generate to those who have the intellectual property rights sort of there, because you create a machine that does it, and then here it's free for everybody. So it could all be free, but here, if the property rights keep going and giving money back to the people who keep getting it, you're going to get this greater and greater division in terms of income. That's what we're facing, and that is not any of the discussion that we're having. That really, you know, the whole patent system, you know, that we have, that is, and the rights, you know, sort of what they're giving property rights to, is having this enormous income distribution issues that are there, that are fundamentally changing, whereas before it could be associated, if people worked here within that, you could get enough income to sort of fit the social level that you were thinking for. Now that's no longer the case. And you're creating two separate societies. And that's happening not only in Greece, but the same thing's happening in the US in a different way.
Okay, we can throw the floor open now for questions. Again, there are two microphones here, and if you'd like to ask a question, please come on up to the mic. Please speak into the mic so it can be recorded. Whatever you're saying is recorded. And if it's a little soft, I'll try and repeat it.
Thanks for coming. Can you hear me, Mike?
Yeah.
I think it's refreshing to hear normative views from people who were taught a positive science. I appreciate that a lot because we're all humans and we do have normative views. That's fantastic. And then this issue about short and long run, I just want to leave a comment from a guy that I admire a lot, Groucho Marx. What do I care about posterity? What's it ever done for me?
My question involves the U.S. that you were talking about. And when the Fed became very active with their policies because they didn't see the government acting in what they thought might be a helpful manner, they lowered interest rates as far as they could. And a number of people believe that that was integral to the formation of several bubbles, which, when they burst, created great economic pain. There are a number of people predicting that by keeping interest rates down at effectively zero, the Fed is creating the next bubble, which will just exacerbate the economic pain. Do you all hold to that, or do you see a different path coming?
Whoever would like to.
I'll just say something from a media perspective. We get that question a lot, whether it's CNBC, Bloomberg, Fox, it doesn't matter. Low interest rates, bubble, a lot of papers being written under anonymous names. And when you dig into it, you find out that the person espousing, or the institution espousing that theory, is undoubtedly going to end up being a gold broker. So I think you have to look at a lot of what you read in the media, and I include myself in that group with a jaded eye, because there's oftentimes an ulterior motive to try to get you as the consumer to buy something that may or may not be a very suitable investment.
I quite agree that that happens a lot. But in terms of answer, are we creating another bubble? Absolutely. Except we never know what's a bubble or what isn't. Because if you take a look, you know, sort of, if we triple the amount of wealth in society, so say we triple it, but people keep spending the same amount as they're currently spending, everyone pictures themselves as better off. But actually, you know, so as long as they keep spending, it's fine. You can think you have as much wealth as you want. The wealth you actually have is something quite different. It's what's real wealth. And real wealth, we talk about real GDP and nominal GDP. How often have you heard it discussed there's real wealth and nominal wealth? You haven't. It's not part of the discussion. And so the easiest way to deal with problems is to create more wealth. Lowering interest rates creates more wealth, because what it does is pushes up asset prices at different levels. We're having a grand aggregate bubble, but the only bubble people talk about are sort of the smaller bubbles on the bubble. You know, our system is a social system that relates. Money is a social system that relates upon people's expectations that things are going to work, that people are going to be paid back in the way. All those expectations are sort of fit together. That's the gigantic bubble that's there. If that breaks, the whole system breaks. So we do not have a real system that can be separated from finance. Finance is at the foundation of our system, which means the foundation of our system is a bubble. And there's no way of getting around it. So it's handling the bubble as opposed to saying, do we have a bubble or not? Now, I think Schiller does the best work in sort of looking at it, because what he says, what's sustainable level of the bubble, you know, that we can have? And when you take a look at it. And so we were way above it in 2007, 2008, and we came down. Guess where we are now? Far above where we were in 2007, 2008. Could that go a lot higher? Yeah, it could double. I remember when a friend, 40 years ago, moved to Silicon Valley and asked me, should he buy a house? You know, he was working for Hewlett-Packard. I said, no, it's a bubble. You know, don't buy real estate. Luckily, he didn't listen to me. He bought where Google now is, and he made a fair amount of money, you know, clearly. You know, and I'm convinced it was a bubble then, but it's a bigger bubble now. So the questions of bubbles, I think, sort of misses the point that it's how often and how long can these bubbles be sustainable? And to the degree you have a Fed that's willing to commit to keeping a bubble going, it can keep it going for a lot longer than what it's currently going. So I'm not worried about it being, you know, pricked right away. But at some point when people say, there is no foundation there, the whole system can collapse. And I don't think there's any way you can model that. You know, so if you take a systems dynamic view of that, how do you model it? You know, unless you get into people's psychology in their head. So.
Well, you brought up a point about wealth versus money, and as a macroeconomist, that's one of the most frustrating things is that people confuse the two in the press. That, you know, if we all have more money, we're all more wealthy. And for example, going back to the Greece again, that they have to cut back, that they spent too much and they have to cut back because they really can't afford anymore. Well, if there's unemployed people, you can afford more. I mean, if this room here is our population and we've got these three sets of seats working and they aren't working over there, we can afford more. We can do more. I mean, so the whole idea of affording things that we bring with us from a micro level doesn't always apply at the macro level. And that, you're talking about how did these policies get placed in Europe. Part of the problem, I think, is just fallacy of composition, that even among economists, where we tend to focus more and more on micro, people don't think about the fact that what's true at the individual level is not necessarily true at the macro level, and you have to stop and think in terms of resources. And then I guess, and what David is saying is in terms of comparing bubbles to resources. We all feel like we're getting more wealthy, but if we don't have any more goods and services, then We're not really.
But John, you say that you can, if you have a quarter of the room that's unemployed, you have resources,
Right.
but do you still have those resources if you don't control your own currency?
You have a difficult time activating those resources, because that's the way I view the debt and the deficit, is that what the federal government is doing is it's activating an idle resource.
But there's another part to it, and that's sort of the contractual foundation. So in other words, yes, you have, say, 25% of the people unemployed, that somehow you have to figure out a contract that they're going to do something and get money, and the people who are actually going to provide the goods and services are willing to do that. That goes to a deeper level that I'm talking about in terms of the property rights. Yeah. That here, given the state of property rights now, there's no contracts that can be worked out. So,
but that money they're going to get has to be more than they could get by collecting welfare.
Yeah, if they're going to actually do something,
right.
You're quite right. And to the degree you've pushed that up, you made it harder for the contractual system to work.
And that's a big problem in the United States, I would say.
Yeah, and the same problem in Greece. They're both the same problem going on. That underlying, if you take a look at the right, the Austrians, they have contractual theories that go on. And the contractual theories sort of say everything is a contractual agreement among these people. And they sort of analyze it as if that's there. Now, clearly it isn't. There's all kinds of implicit contracts that are there that people lose. But the nature that there is this contractual stuff, that if people feel violated and say, here, they're getting something for nothing, it undermines the system. Sort of because here it's there. So the answer is, you never give it to the people in the first place. Once you've given it out, there's something I call the takeaway principle. Okay? And that is that it's 5 times harder to take something away from somebody than never to give it to them to begin with. And I know that from having kids. Because if you give them that, ice cream cone, and then take it away, man, you are in for trouble. On the other hand, if you say no, they'll scream and yell, but they'll get over it. That's exactly what's happening. The problems have to be dealt with before they generate. You cannot sort of redistribute income. You cannot solve the problems now that they're trying in Greece by saying, here, just give them the money. That undermines it. You have to solve it from the beginning. And if you're not solving it there, you're not really solving the problem.
We'll go to a question here, please.
Yeah, so hello. So if I may introduce myself, I'm Hugo, so I come from France. So I'm really listening to your discussion with great interest because I'm really interested in economics. And I think that, in my opinion, the question I would like to ask you is regarding the sustainability of the current economic paradigm. Do you think that the current paradigm is still sustainable for, let's say, a long run, like 50 years? Because basically, from what I could see is that the crisis couldn't be forecast, and it seems that everything on which the model is built, on which a system is built, seems to be totally flawed. So do you think that it's possible to carry on with such a system that is... Sorry. So is it possible to carry on with such a system which presents a lot of flaws, a lot of things that are contradicted on a really regular basis? This is the question I would like to ask.
In terms of, when you say paradigm, I think school of thought, but you actually mean the way the system is organized. Can it keep on going like this? I don't think so. I think the problem is going to become increasingly that the more productive we become, the more difficult it's going to be to find something for the people over here on this side of the classroom, of the room to do. If it took all of us to produce all the goods and services we had to produce to survive, well, then we're all going to be employed. But then as productivity rises further and further, we got to find something for those folks over there to do that, as David was saying, everyone else feels is fair. That I'm okay with giving you, a bushel of corn for, I don't know, mowing my grass or something like that. I think that there are a lot of deflationary pressures throughout the world that are causing situations like austerity, and I think it's going to be a long-run problem. So I don't know what comes next, but I'm not sure that it's going to look a lot like this.
Again, I'm not sure what you mean by paradigm either. It's something.
I think just the organizational system.
Sort of. But here, I thought you were talking in terms of the theory of economics.
Let's say the neoliberal theory.
Right. So that's what I thought you were talking about.
I answered the wrong question. Okay.
And neoliberal theory is what he said. But I think what you mean is economic theory. Here, it didn't predict the crisis. Sort of. Soon after the crisis, I wrote a piece, sort of saying here they didn't predict it. I didn't blame them for not predicting it at all because it was unpredictable. So what I blamed them for was having a model that did not even allow for the possibility of the crisis. But I also said that is not going to have any effect on the economics profession at all, because the economics profession does not depend on what's going on in the economy. As a matter of fact, the worse the economy goes, the better it is for economists. It's the same thing with the doctor problem. Here, they don't have they don't want to solve all your problems because then they eliminate their need. So there hasn't been, sort of any movement away. And the macroeconomists I know are very self-satisfied with what they're doing. Their focus is we are publishing and we are doing a deep understanding of the system as best we can. Now the problem is, as best we can is roughly 1/1000th of the total understanding of the macroeconomy. Now going back to the earlier question about normative issues, the way classical economists dealt with that was to say economic theory has nothing to do with policy, and we're not pretending that it does. Policy is a matter for statesmen, and it's about heuristics. It is not about science. And heuristics are sort of figuring out, here's a model that'll work, and sort of go and let normative judgments come in, let whatever comes in, and sort of make the arguments along those lines, using the analytics to support the heuristics, rather than sort of saying, here, I have a deep scientific theory that is leading to something. Economics is structured around a scientific theory and isn't going to change.
Usman.
I have a two-part question. I hope this is working. First, growth. That is a word economists love to talk about all the time. And management, the field from which I come, loves that. We have talked about limits to growth. We've talked about the rates of growth. Where do you think is the debate to go or should go in terms of understanding what is manageable growth? And then on a lighter side, I have a second part question. Do you see any change in the debates that we will hear for the presidential election next year that will be qualitatively different than what we have been hearing every 4 years?
Can we answer the second one first?
Yeah, it's an easier question.
All three of us. 1, 2, 3, no.
No.
So I thought.
I'll touch on the growth issue. I think we're an affluent society. We have much more income than what we need as a society. We have a society built upon creating desires in people and then filling them. And so you have to fit that sort of part of the structure in. Now, economics used to think about that. So when classical economists talked about it, their worry was, we're going to have solved the economic problem. The answer is we have solved the economic problem. What we haven't solved is the social problem that's associated with it. How do we make people happy with what they have when there's plenty out there to go around, even for those people undergoing austerity? Now, we talk about Greece going through austerity, but if you were looking at it outside, it is not people starving. It is not austerity in the sense of the 1930s even. It's, oh my God, we can't go out and get our coffee. It's a quite different set of issues that are there. And we have not sort of dealt with those normative issues. And it's economists' fault in many ways by saying it's a positive science. It is a positive science, but science has nothing to do with policy. Policy is by nature a normative judgment and has to have normative judgments in order to answer anything. And economists have been unwilling to sort of put their particular normative judgments in. But you have it, John Kenneth Galbraith so go back. And his, book on, the affluent society. So I said, we've got way more than what we need. Now, how do we deal with that problem?
Thank you.
So I want to say I appreciate your reference to the to a fallacy of composition there. Just any kind of formal rhetorical reference, I always appreciate that. Thank you. So I also want to go to back to one of these normative things, one of these policy things that really economists don't have anything to do with. But the United States Federal Reserve has some normative goals with respect to inflation and growth and unemployment. And I'd like for the three of you to comment on those goals and what they should be, where they should have them, and if they are what they should be.
There's not so much they can do about unemployment is the problem. I mean, well, during the financial crisis, because I remember at one point Bernanke saying, I've pushed the interest rates as low as I can go. This is all I can do. The rest is up to Congress. So, I mean, as far as, and inflation is a much more complicated issue. I mean, our big bout with inflation really was because of OPEC. It wasn't because of, oh no, somebody left the money supply turned on. Who did that? And so, my personal worry as a macroeconomist is more unemployment. And as a consequence, there's not much the Fed can do about that other than push, interest rates down that they have. They're kind of powerless. So they may have goals, but I don't know how they achieve them. Well, I guess by not raising interest rates to 20%.
Right. Notionally, they have an inflation goal rate of 2%,
right.
And they're supposed to take some actions if unemployment is, I'm not sure what the number is.
5.5.
5.5.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're supposed to do something, and they're supposed to trade off the interest rates based on those things.
Right.
And I think it's a growth number they're looking for, like 3%.
Yeah. I also think the underlying theory that they're using to decide that is a bad theory. So, but that's.
When you look at the way they're calculating unemployment too, you look at the spread between U6 and
right.
U3 now. It's unusual to see the spreads that you see now. I wish the Fed would. Many times during the last 6 years, I wish the Federal Reserve had just said to Congress, screw. Why don't you guys do something productive for the American people? Aside from leaving it up, because they blame the Fed, which has a very limited arsenal, whereas Congress could do all kinds of things that would have, you look at the state of disrepair of our country and what could have been done back in 2009. What did we peak out for unemployment? 10.5%, right? Think about the underutilized resources that we had and still continue to have today. And it's not due to the failure of the Fed, it's due to the incompetence of our political leaders. And yet we'll continue to vote the same dopes in every couple of years.
I'll just say one thing. There's been an enormous change. I don't know if people have recognized it, sort of in the way in which inflation is talked about. You used to talk about an inflation target as being something you wanted to come under. That was always the way it was discussed. Yeah. If you've noticed, there's been this subtle change with almost no discussion that inflation is a target we're trying to get up to. If I go back to the 1970s, people would just say, what?
Yeah.
Milton Friedman wrote an article that the optimal rate of inflation is minus 2%. And the debate in the 1980s, should we shoot for 0 or should we shoot for 2? Yeah. So it was there. But if you were 0, you're much better off. That whole discussion has changed with almost no discussion at all by economists. And that's amazing to me.
How much of that is related to the stagnation of our population?
I don't think very much at all is related to it. It's related to the fact, so that here, the way we can solve our problems. So you have this contractual problems among people. Somehow we've given too much to a whole group of rich people. We got to take money away from them. What's the best way to take money away? Inflation. So really what we'd like is an inflation goal of 5%. 6% is really what they're talking about. So there's some push for using a GDP target, a nominal GDP target, which was just another way to move up that inflation target. If we had 7-8% inflation, if we really started it, you'd find there'd be changes in the wealth distribution. And that's sort of, again, the unwillingness to talk about that wealth distribution is, I think, the key. Now, unemployment, is a separate issue. We don't need all kinds of jobs for all kinds of people to do. What we need is sort of to give challenges to people that are there. I have opposed the minimum wage. I've argued instead, if you're going to create a minimum wage, create a minimum job, a guaranteed job for everybody, a way in which individuals can transfer their activities or something into income. Then you don't avoid, you're not saying here, I'm creating unemployment. I have to deal with both issues simultaneously. If you raise the minimum wage, say, to $15, which is what people would say you'd like, what you're going to find is there's so many ways, number one, in terms of how much you can ship abroad and produce abroad, so you have globalization problems. The second is the automation problem. That here you can automize and, just make it, I was just reading, probably 40% of the current jobs now can be eliminated in the next 5 to 10 years through computers. Now the question is, that will be better for everybody because you don't have to do them, but who's going to get money of all the things that they were doing? That's really the question one has to look at. And nobody's talking about it.
And I'm glad to hear you say that about unemployment, or minimum wage, because I've gotten in a lot of trouble with my friends over saying that I too am against it. I want the market to be such that the employer is like, oh my God, I can't get anybody for less than $15 an hour. That's what I want. I want people to earn $15 an hour, but not by legislating it, by having the demand for labor through, say, guaranteed job programs to be, such that, well, I can't get, and we don't have a minimum wage for college professors at $1,000 a year because we don't need to, because they can't get anybody for $1,000 a year. So we want.
Yes, they can. They're called adjuncts.
Adjuncts? Well, other than college professors.
You haven't dealt with English professors.
Question over here.
So what I was going to say is there's a video called Visualizing a Plenitude Economy that gets at a lot of the problems that you were discussing. And so one of the suggestions in that video was, instead of having a minimum wage, you restrict the work hours. So you have more people earning the same amount of money. And that was one kind of like remembrance I had from the discussions you had. I also had a comment for what you were getting into about property, contractual agreements underlying societies. And this isn't my own words, but somebody else did this. It was Thomas Jefferson enshrined certain inalienable rights in the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He was inspired in part by John Locke, who wrote about the rights of life, liberty, and property. That's an interesting switch from property to the pursuit of happiness. In some ways, I think we've gotten those two mixed up, and the pursuit of happiness has become a pursuit of property. So I thought that was an interesting quote in the sense of your arguments. I don't know if that was really a question, but more a comment. I mean, does that kind of like get at what you were saying?
To some degree, yes. I mean, so our problem is, what do we do with our life? So the deep problem there, there's all kinds of things we can do with it. And lots of things could make us happy, sort of at lots of different income levels. But, so we have a society designed around sort of saying, here, you want all this stuff you don't really want. But here, yes, I want it in other people. I don't want to give it away to other people. It's there. And it exists, let's say, with college professors. It's a wonderful job being a college professor. It could not be a better job. We are paid way, way too much. Notice what I'll get. Here, how can you say that? Because there's all kinds of people who would love to do it for the pay that we're getting. I've argued if we're moving towards that way, you need something called an avocational wage, as opposed to a vocational wage. Jobs that are fun should get paid a lot less than jobs that aren't fun. And that means lots of middle-class jobs are way, way overpaid. And if they weren't overpaid, there'd be plenty to go around for the rest. It isn't the rich. There aren't enough of them. It's the middle class. So,
well, you know, and you mentioned my love of Star Trek. Actually, I guess I mentioned that when I wrote it in the bio that you read. But there was an episode of Star Trek where this fella, you know, as always happens on a science fiction show, somebody from the 20th century has been trapped in time, and he shows up, and of course they make fun of the Texan. And the Texan is saying to Captain Picard, well, gosh, if you all aren't, you know, buying and selling, you know, and trying to make a fortune, what do you do with your lives? Where's the challenge? You know, and Captain Picard says, well, you know, I learn. I mean, I go around and learn about the world. He's an anthropologist. He plays it, you know, like his musical instruments and so forth. But the Texan from the 20th century was totally confused. How do I challenge myself? And there's more than one thing you can do. It doesn't have to be. I always think of under the New Deal, paying historians to wander around the United States and write down what, you know, people's experiences. I made my poor wife on our honeymoon go to Civil War battlefields, and maybe that was her idea. I don't remember. But one of the things in one of the gift shops was a book that was written during that period, during the New Deal. A historian had gone around and interviewed people who had been slaves, all right? Well, they were almost dead. There were almost none left. Now, is this going to make a lot of money? I don't know. But it would have been a piece of information we would never, ever have had again. And these people were about 12 when slavery ended, all right? So they weren't, you know, would have been nice to hear somebody that wasn't a kid, but if we hadn't written that down, we'd have never had it again. And we had enough goods and services. So, you know, if that's something that everyone else is okay with, those of you that are producing the goods and services, if it's okay with you to give them, you know, food, shelter, and clothing for writing this, then I think it was a useful thing. Over here.
So just to start out, as a graduate researcher and adjunct professor, I really appreciated that last joke about adjunct pay. Anyway. So my question in terms of is about kind of, you're talking about housing as well as bubbles. And there's been some really interesting kind of research being done on what Berlin has just done with their rent caps. I don't know if anyone's heard about this, but Berlin's been a very hot city in terms of the market, and they're putting these rent caps on their properties. And the legacy of that is that in places like Germany, there is a much higher rental market and a much lower home ownership market. And places like Greece and Spain, also the United States, there is a much higher home ownership market. So my basic question is, what do you think, now we have some distance between, at least in the United States, the current moment and the financial crisis, what is the government's role in incentivizing home ownership?
I don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah, but Barry, it sounds like something you'd be.
I think a lot of people get paid as a result of home ownership. And if you look at lobbyists, whether it's tax lobbyists, construction lobbyists, you know, the old saying is, we've got the best Congress money can buy. And unfortunately, it's sadly true. And many of the laws that we have written around, tax laws that we have written around home ownership, they make it conducive, and those laws were put into place, like the mortgage interest deduction, the property tax deduction. That's why we have a home ownership rate of, 60%? Home ownership rate. And right now, I question how much longer home ownership can be as strong as it is based on our population and the demographics. You know, my generation, or our generation, the four of us up here, we were the property owners. I don't know that our children's generation is going to want to own or have the ability to own quite as many properties.
But there'll be as many properties out there as before, and we're building another 1.5 million each year. So there'll be plenty of properties out there. The question will, who will own them, and how will they be rented versus the other? Now, to the degree you have a choice, clearly home ownership means here you have wealth more equally distributed. So that's something very much that's useful. Now, Germany sort of had low home ownership, but if you notice, the rents were low and the housing prices were low. They never had any of the housing inflation that existed before. I think what Berlin is doing is wrong, putting the caps on, because you'll sort of end up with a New York type situation where, because of all the limitations on it, the particular places where you're going in, my son just went down there to work, paying $3,500 a month for his apartment. I mean, that's sort of the basic, if you want to live in Manhattan, that's what you're paying now. Now that means, unless you're going into finance, sort of you're pretty much out of that market, and that's the rental market.
You're living in the Bronx.
And so trying to deal with just the little pieces creates all kinds of other problems, and that's my biggest point. That really, so the problems are systemic in a very deep way, and that the way we have to deal with them is on those deeper levels. And I don't think that's been part of the policy discussion in the U.S., and it should be.
I have a question over here.
Hi, my name's Bruce Scorin. So a number of times you guys have kind of talked about Congress and it's dysfunctional and the leaders and they're making bad decisions and things. And I know it's kind of a political science domain, but there's also obviously economic motivators for why policy making is so broken. And I'd just like to hear some of your guys' thoughts on, is it money in politics? Is it the revolving door? Is it term limits? Do we have the wrong people running for office that can't think critically about these issues? And, of those issues, what can we realistically do about it in the near term if we're going to start trying to take on all these other policies, issues that simply aren't getting discussed because of the way that system works currently?
I think we're screwed. I really do.
I do too.
I mean, I really do. I think that it's too deeply embedded, and the state where we live is causing a whole lot of problems in the politicians that we're providing to the rest of the country and the great ideas we're providing to the rest of the country. So I was a political science major, but that was a long time ago. I don't know what do you guys.
I just see so much corruption. I talk to these guys every day, and they spend 1 or 2 hours a day in their offices, and they spend 8 to 10 hours a day raising money.
Yeah.
They don't. And if you think they care about you as a person or their constituents, I got you're smoking dope. I mean, these are bad people. Many of them are really bad people.
Let me take the contrary stand. I think there's a lot of good people in government. So I've had discussions with them. They understand the issues, but they don't know how do we deal with it and get elected. So a lot is not that here they don't want to deal with it. It's they feel as much caught within the system as anybody else. So I, have had really good discussions with them. One time I went in and said, they invited me to the White House to come and discuss some of my ideas. And Alfred Kahn, it was about inflation, had me in. And, I went in and told him, here's my plan of how to deal with the problem. And he said, you have not been here. I don't want to say. I got in trouble, testifying for Congress for talking about bananas. And it was he had said there's going to be a recession. And they said, you can't say a recession, so every time instead of saying recession, he said it's going to go bananas. And, had made it. And he said, if they know you're in here, I'm finished. Because you're talking about structural changes which are much larger than the creation of the Federal Reserve. Because I was suggesting some changes in the way in which property rights and prices would exist. So it was changing property rights. He said, those are not part of the discussion. And that is really the problem, that I think we have good people there trying to do it, who have to also get elected. That can make them very, very cynical, as I think we are. But at the same time, they'd like to figure it out. And I think that goes back to the vision that we have of human beings. There's a sense in economics that human beings are selfish, and that they're selfish in all aspects of life. That is not the vision that Adam Smith had of human beings. The vision he had is people have a selfish nature and they have a caring nature, that combination. Our society has not nurtured the caring nature and said that is what we have to have when people are in Congress doing a whole variety of things, because it's sort of been blended into one and not separated. So I think the real answer is to say, yes, they're selfish. You can be selfish. But, so be selfish about achieving your social ends. And rather than saying, I want to go out and have 5 houses, say, I'd like to go out and help 30 people, young kids. That's my challenge. And if I can get those 30 kids through, I will have had a successful life. That you channel people's sort of competitive nature into doing what they think is good. Not what government tells them is good, but what they think by bringing out that basic nature. And sort of that's the type of policy that I've been advocating.
Everybody, we are bumping up against the end of the session here, but I've been told we can extend it a little longer if we're rolling. My sense is we're rolling. Do we want to just stay here until the last 4 questions have been asked and answered? Is that okay for folks? Okay, why don't we do that? So I guess we'll go over here next, please.
Yeah, I'm Paul Carr. Thanks for raising the issue of the disparity between the rich and the poor. It's a big political issue. I've looked at the data on the increase in the national debt and also the disparity between the rich and poor. Piketty has some data. And the bump that I see, the increase is that when Reagan came in and repealed the tax, reduced the taxes on the rich, that's when the national debt went up, and that's when the disparity between the rich and the poor increased. So why not just simply go back to our old tax structure where the rich paid much larger taxes than they do today. I mean, back in I think in the 60s, the highest tax rate was like 90%. And if you're making $10 million or $100 million, you can afford 90% in taxes.
When they had the 90% tax rate, a lot of what they had were all kinds of loopholes to get around it. And the problem is, if you take a look at people earning money now, sort of you get the increase in capital gains, that's 15%. So then you have a whole set of things that's structured how you can avoid the taxes. So even when we had the much higher taxes, we had all the ways of getting around it. Sort of in the way options are valued. You look at a whole bunch of things. It isn't the tax rates. Sort of it is the entire structure of the problem. And, it goes back to my takeaway principle. Once you've given it to somebody, it is much, much harder to take it away, and that's what you're doing with taxes. The answer is to not have to tax, but not to give it to the people in the first place, which means here the set of institutional structures that are channeling money there. Why do we have so many students wanting to go to college? Is it because we're teaching them so much deep understanding? No. The answer is it's a way to get a better job and a higher income. So the reason we professors can get paid so much are that we're sort of the coal that people have to go through, and we're taking our take. And it's not only us, it's everybody. And so until we start looking at our effect on the system, I don't think the system's going to change. It's always the other people's effect.
Yeah. Income distribution. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Yeah.
I hear the 3 of you agreeing on some of the most fundamental problems. You were asked by the speaker to think of what's the most important global problem facing the world, not this country, and what can system dynamics do about it. I happened to serve as the exec officer for the Limits to Growth Research Group, and I watched 3 Nobel economists bludgeon Dennis Meadows when he tried to explain to them what the world model meant. I think nearly all of the economics professors seconded that blow with a massive club. I suggest that the thing you agree on is that our decision-making mechanisms are expected to react quickly to long-range problems. Long-range, I mean 50 years, 100 years. The Voting Rights Act of 1968 is in big trouble by chiseling at restricting the vote. We haven't solved that problem yet. If we have 50-year problems and one-year solutions, we're not going to work with it. System dynamics can at least illustrate some of the unforeseen one-year solutions have great difficulty. Our decision-making mechanisms have not been modernized in this country to reflect the speed of electronics. Our Constitution was framed when horseback was the fastest way to reach from Boston to the capital of the country. Now we reach the population in an instant. Electronics had not progressed beyond Ben Franklin's experiment with a key on a kite string when the Constitution was framed. We have a House of Representatives that is re-elected every 2 years en masse. They begin campaigning for the next election before they take office, in some cases, for the last election. That needs to be changed. The House is the most critical. The Senate only changes 1/3 of its voting capacity every 2 years. So it's a 6-year term for people. The president is in between those two at 4 years to election. And few of our presidents have had the eloquence to persuade the legislature, particularly the House, to pass some action. I heard another voice. So if we think of world problems and the long time horizon that's required to make the public understand, I think our role as system dynamicists is to clarify for the public the need for a longer time horizon on their part to deal with long-range problems.
Any reaction?
Well, if I may go back to the fact that I was not born in this country, I just read something the other day that, and I don't know the relative benefits here of a parliamentary system versus what we have. It was an article on how the U.S. would have been better off had they not won the revolution. And the third item was, I think one of them was that there wouldn't have been the genocide of the Indians. I guess Andrew Jackson wouldn't have, from Melanie's home state, wouldn't have done that. And, but the third item was the parliamentary system that they thought would do a better job of preserving democracy. I don't know. It's too late now. The U.S. did win.
I think the issue in terms of long-run problems, how one deals with, is a fundamental issue. I have no answer to it. But I think you're very right that it is there. I'm not sure how much systems dynamics actually can capture that. That's something I just don't know. But clearly, if you pointed out the problem, it's there. The next question is, how does one, sort of actually resolve that problem? And, those are very difficult problems.
Okay, we had two more questions queued up over here.
I'm Nancy Hayden. I'm both an employee of Sandia National Laboratories, but I'm on sabbatical and doing dissertation work at University of Maryland. So I also hear a common theme among your talks, and if I make an inference from your several statements that part of the problem is that we're not having the discussion that we need to be having, it implies that a discussion would be part of the solution. So, and then I've also heard that our political system and our policymakers are in a system that constrains them from having that discussion. And so the question is, where does that discussion need to happen? How can it be effective? At what level? From the top down, from the bottom up? And then have you seen other systems? It seems to be a very Western-centric model that you're assuming drives the world. And are there other systems, either at small local levels or national levels, where you see some vision that could be different?
I think, so there really is a challenge that's coming to sort of Western democracies from the system that we have in China today, which is sort of a political system, non-democratic, sort of managed by engineers. I mean, that's essentially it. It's sort of trying to deal with this long-run problem. It's not clear to me which is going to win of these two systems. I haven't seen, the advocacy I have is much more bottom-up, that individuals be giving a lot more control. There's a nice book by Philip Howard called The Rule of Nobody, that discusses, sort of the need sort of for individual responsibility within the system and how one might go there, and changing regulation to more principles-based regulation as opposed to sort of law-based regulation. I just published a book called Complexity in the Art of Public Policy, where I argue very strongly that you have to have a norms policy that sort of says, here is what we think is good. Sort of here, within that, let people come from the bottom up and solve the problems. Don't try and solve them from the top down, because it creates sort of negative sort of aspects and people fight it. If people can develop it on their own, and they have needs for much more than material goods. Economists have solved the material good problems. It's the spiritual, the non-material problems that are there, and that's very much an important part of life that, sort of economists can't solve. So my solution to that in the book was to eliminate sort of all the divisions of the social sciences, combine sociology, economics, political science, all into one department, and then let them decide and fight it out. Because there's often says there's no pluralism in economics. There isn't. That's because all the people, one group went to sociology, and another group went to psychology in that. So we've divided the people up as opposed to forcing them to pull together. Then we talk about having interdisciplinary work that can never be interdisciplinary because it's not taught in an interdisciplinary way.
Well said.
Okay, another question, yeah, and I think, do you have a question too as well? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. So we'll go here, and then that'll be it for this evening. So go over here first. We're just going back. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Vasilis, and I come from a central Mediterranean country that's in a lot of trouble. I'll give you 3 chances to guess where I come from, or to scratch that. You all know where I come from. Anyways, I had 2 comments on the items being discussed. One is that the European Union it's clearly stated in the founding, so to speak, charters of the European Union that there's a moral basis for the European Union, that there's an underlying moral reason to control the way these, the Eurozone economies antagonize each other. And at the same time, Germany, in its constitution, has it written that the German federal government must maintain a balanced sheet, and there's a limit on how much loan it can get and how much each of the Bundesländer, the countries in the German Federation can borrow. So it's a clear-cut example that Germany views itself first as a financial entity and secondly as a political entity, or rather I'd say they view themselves as a political entity that expresses itself through financial means. This ergo means that any antagonism that they produce is financial, and this is, you know, it comes in direct contrast with the principles of Europe. Somehow nobody comes out and, you know, talks about this contrast, these discrepancies in nominal principles and real principles, to borrow something that was said before. And also, the second comment has to do with the way I see the future developing in Greece, and I think throughout the Eurozone. I believe there will be huge discrepancies within the workforce itself, as the middle class sees its worth, worth as a workforce being devaluated, as people will lose properties and accumulate more debt, like it's about to happen in Greece. I believe that this part of the workforce, which is highly trained and it's the force behind European innovation, will find itself in dire straits, will find itself in situations where essentially they start sort of living hand to mouth, but it's not exactly that. And this will, I believe, actually lead to, obviously, to differences in income and essentially to even worse economic problems, simply because no political authority in Europe right now has a more comprehensive, more systemic view of things. So I'd like your comments on that.
I'll just say, again, I don't know enough specifically about that to really answer. The one thing I would answer is 49 of the 50 states in the US have limitations that they can take on no, sort of debt. They have limitations on that. They figure out ways around it.
They violate it.
They violate it all the time, but, it's there on the books, all except Vermont. Vermont's the only one that doesn't have it, and it probably does better than most of the other ones. But, those are seen as part of the need in terms of a fiscal system. So that doesn't seem to me unusual that Germany within that would have it, and that the euro within that would have it. The problem is you let it be violated. And when you let it be violated, how do you then deal with it? That's something I just don't know.
I sense that there's a lot of resistance to acknowledging that the euro is a failure. I look at Greece now as a police officer who's in a gunfight who gave up his gun. And I think Greece is in a terrible situation. And I talked to people that were consulting with Varoufakis and with Jamie Galbraith, and there is no workable solution in that situation. And for the life of me, I can't understand why rooms like this, full of really smart people, can't recognize that Greece would be better off leaving the Eurozone and recreating their own currency in the long run.
Right. Yeah.
Short run, it's going to be 5 years of pain.
Right.
And then they will be markedly better off if they were just to leave the Eurozone. But I'll tell you, it's very difficult to get a consensus on that and to get somebody to publicly state that, like pulling teeth.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's right. And people say, well, there'll be all kinds of financial chaos. Well, what do you call this now? I mean, it already is financial chaos.
Financial chaos.
Yeah, I mean, so we might as well have
worse.
Financial chaos. Yeah, probably it would be. But a financial chaos that has a good outcome in the long, or a more hopeful outcome.
I think that the real difficulty will be in the short term. You saw what happened. The Eurozone and the ECB just tightened that noose every day a little bit for about 4 weeks. And then there was coffee shortages. And then you had stories breaking that diabetics couldn't get their insulin, and you knew exactly where it was going. Right? I was watching this from a media perspective, and I could see how the Greeks felt, right, where they voted 70% to against the austerity, but they weren't willing to take the pain. I think the Greek people need to say, screw, we are going to take the bullet. Yeah, we're going to have old people that die in the streets, but you know what? We're going to take the pain now so we can survive. And you know what? I don't think the rest of the world will let that happen. I think the IMF will step in and won't allow that to happen. But honestly, the actions on the part of the ECB, I think, are unconscionable. But I think the actions, or the lack of actions, on the part of the Greek leadership, they were at the point where they needed to say, nope, we're leaving. And we're going to print our own currency, and yeah, it's going to get really ugly. We're not going to have any gasoline. We're going to have food shortages. Utility companies are going to be in trouble. Some people aren't going to be able to get their medications. But 20 years from now, we're going to be a lot better off for it. And they failed to do that. And it's going to happen. It's just a matter, does it happen in 5 years or 10 years?
Well, that's right. That's the other thing, is it's going to happen eventually. Yeah. So, yeah.
Just like Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
You know, the best thing about Greece is it's taken all the concentration off of Puerto Rico.
Our final question for this evening's session.
Right, I'd like to redirect back to the scientific theory a little bit of the professions that you guys represent. And I'm interested in really how the evolution of your sciences are going to evolve. I appreciated the multidisciplinary approach. Well, I'll give you 2 points that we're experiencing in the real world. So first of all, let me just say, from a system dynamics perspective, there's this thing called the carrying capacity of a system. At the carrying capacity of a system, independent variables converge. At the convergence, all things become correlated. So let me use 2 examples now. One is in the modern portfolio theory, which was developed in the 1960s. The fundamental underlying theorem is diversification will save you. If you look at the world today, prices are correlating positively, which means the diversification theory is no longer working. Yet we're still seeing the graduates coming out of the finance schools that are teaching these prophecies. And those theorems are no longer holding true, and we're putting a lot of people in peril in society that are relying on these professionals for asset management advice. The second theory, as another example, is the modern day business cycle as we know it is no longer working, it's dampening. These are all conditions that we in this room would describe as reaching the system's carrying capacity. And these theorems are very explainable in the sciences that we work within. But more importantly, how will the universities that are putting out these people that people in society are relying on for their judgments and for the allocation of their resources, their assets, and their theorems, how is the professions that you gentlemen represent going to adapt to these problems of these theorems that are no longer working in this new set of conditions?
They won't. I mean, that was something I was going to talk about later, is that economics doesn't focus that much on policy. And I think David is saying maybe that's not a terrible thing. I think it is. I think that the days when we used to write for policy reasons are gone. We write to impress each other. We write for another economist to say, "Oh my gosh, that was so clever." You get a publication, and the reward system is built to where even if you don't agree that that's a good idea, if you want tenure and promotion, then you have to still do it. So, and there doesn't have to be a link between whether it works in the real world. Journals aren't ranked highly because, oh, that journal's done a great job of explaining the real world. So I don't know that there's a real good connection between failed theory and then adjustment in the discipline. I don't know, and David knows a lot more about this than I do, so I'm going to make you answer now.
Again, I think there were a number of different themes in what I heard there. Let me try and answer one of them. I think economists sort of understand diversifiable risk and non-diversifiable risk. They talk very much about idiosyncratic risk and that. I think, sort of overall, they haven't sort of dealt with the fact that here so much of it is psychological, and it goes way beyond anything we can provide a solid foundation for, because if you admit that, and everyone says that, the system breaks down. So the system is based on an illusion, And it's a necessary illusion almost. In some ways, the way you think of religion, oftentimes here, that, sort of people need some belief that there is something that will hold the system together. A system that evolves and a complex system that has sort of developed over time exists because it's unimaginable how it works, but somehow it holds together. And that, I think, sort of ultimately is the type system we have. And so trying to sort of handle finance there is just, you can't. There's no answer. I look at here, everyone said, oh, this. I don't know which one, and I wouldn't pay any of them, sort of anything. Because, so it isn't there. I can sort of figure it out as much as anybody else, and it's all up in the air. That said, the answer is, of course, we don't need all that wealth. Sort of the society has way too much wealth. If you go back to the 1700s, people weren't worried about wealth. People were worried whether they're going to go to heaven. It was really that. And heaven lasts forever. And so what you start doing is saying here, how can I sort of build up my, wealth with God in order that I'll go to heaven as opposed to die? And sort of it was seen, the whole social structure was structured around sort of that people wouldn't worry about having wealth, and you shouldn't get more wealth. It was only with double entry bookkeeping that you started to have people saying, here, we can get more wealth. Before, that was not part of the system. When you see social systems in that way, much larger evolution, you become much more, yes, the system will figure out how to handle it and evolve, probably in ways that we haven't at all dreamed of. But it, like Greece, if it falls, will put something back together. And what will be back together will be there. And if we go to physics, there's probably 1 billion parallel universes there, all trying different ones. And you have somebody way up on top sort of looking, which one is going to work?
Okay, well, anyway, I guess.
What can you say after that?
Great job. I'm sure our panel members will be willing to stay around for a short time after we conclude here to answer any questions offline. But at this point, would you please join me in thanking them for a very nice fireside chat this evening? Thank you very much and good evening.